for those of you that are not familiar, this is my brother, full disclosure. I have a great family that kind of, we like the family that plays together. I don't know, plays together. My brother lives in Oregon, but he is a great researcher and historian and loves to put together these programs for us. And I think you enjoy them as much as he enjoys putting them together, although I did have to twist his arm to do sort of more modern day stuff. My brother is an anachronism. He should have been born in another time. Living in this 21st century is not easy for him sometimes, and it's hard for him to be reminded of, like, I don't know, his history repeats itself, or we just don't learn. Yeah. It's frustrating. It's like really hitting your head up against the wall because we're making mistakes and we made them already and we fixed them and then we're making more mistakes on top of it. It's a little frustrating for him, but he likes to look back to find out, how we got here, maybe, or maybe, I don't know, ponder why we got here, how we got here, why we got here. But this is a part of a politics, power, and government series for the Mill. We took a break. We were doing presidents for a while, and we took a break right after Hoover, and we decided to wait on Roosevelt and maybe table Roosevelt and do a more in-depth series on Roosevelt, or not. But right now we are ending this series, I think, and we're going to go into some particular periods in time. I think, did we decide on the War of 1812?
Yeah.
A war that a lot of people don't know a lot about. So that's a cheerful holiday, lecture, War of 1812. And then we decided that January, I have to look at my notes because I forget everything. We're going to do something a little different. For we tend to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. Around January, and so we're going to take a different look at a different side of history with Martin Luther King Jr.'s brother. So that's coming up, but always something interesting, Chuck. So today we're talking about gerrymandering, and as Trish says, gerrymandering. We're going to meander through gerrymandering and look at the history and how we got here. And I actually have our parents on the phone, so I have to go. So I'll let you take it away, Chuck.
Okay, Michelle, thank you once again. And as always, it is a pleasure to be here. And I really do enjoy preparing these presentations for you folks out there. So once again, thanks for being out there. And let me begin by quoting a New Jersey historian very briefly. This is not relative necessarily to our today's topic, but it's relative to me. And here's the quote: "I have reached the conclusion that, at least in my case, history should never emerge so dull as it was taught to me. And this has bred a determination, even an obstinacy, to do something about it." And that's from Henry Charlton Beck, the Reverend Henry Charlton Beck, esteemed New Jersey historian and folklorist. And I'm taking those words to heart. And we begin with our story, the saga of gerrymandering. And it is an American saga. There isn't much history of gerrymandering and such before our history, because the idea of representative government was fairly new, at least in the 1700s. So it was kind of a new idea, the idea of drawing up districts and having representatives for districts and such. So it does start pretty much at the very beginning of our founding. The idea of representing districts and getting to draw the district lines starts kind of with us from scratch. There's evidence in Britain before our history of shenanigans in voting. One of the examples I came across was something called the Rotten Borough Syndrome, which was the English version of tainting districts by basically gaining power illicitly. And so that is the theme behind gerrymandering in our history as well. So we begin with, that's a beautiful map, by the way, very colorful. And we begin with the story beginning in the 1780s. And we're going to talk about first Patrick Henry. We see here the map we'll have kind of featured in a little while, but we begin with actually a pre-gerrymandering gerrymander. And this is the story of Patrick Henry, James Madison, and James Monroe. So we go to the next slide and we'll see Patrick Henry, Virginia statesman of the 1700s. He's, of course, known for his famous extremist statement, "Give me liberty or give me death." He was not a very cooperative individual, very outspoken against the Constitution in the 1780s, and thus became known as an anti-federalist. And in the role of anti-federalist in the 1788 period, just as we're beginning to roll as a nation, Henry decides to meddle with the expected election of James Madison to a congressional seat in Virginia. Henry is opposed to Madison, and so he plants his friend, at the time anti-federalist James Monroe, in the race to try to upset Madison's alleged easy victory. And Henry ends up failing in this attempt. The 1879 results kept Madison in his expected victory position, and Henry was left foiled in the background in Virginia. This is the first example of an attempt to manipulate a voting map to include, at the time, likely votes against Madison. And as I mentioned, it backfired. He lost by about 300 votes. That would be Mr. Monroe. So Henry goes back to his behind-the-scenes mechanisms, fighting against the Constitution. So we move forward again to the period about 2 decades after this, around the 1810 period. And we will, well, first we have to go forward to meet Madison Monroe. There's the 5th District contestants in 1788. And of course, both went on to become presidents. It's the only time 2 presidents ever faced each other in a congressional election. Madison is of course, legendary founding father who gradually brings Monroe along to his way of thinking. Monroe, as a successor to Madison later on in the 1800s, doesn't really change tactic too much from Madison. So they end up more or less becoming similar in view. But at this time, we don't see much in the way of gerrymandering. They're basically coming up with the districts in the first place. They're doing one thing, though, that's interesting at this time. Because the Constitution does not have any mandate on how these districts can be drawn or need to be drawn, the Constitution is relying on the state legislatures to do this in a fair and even fashion. And so the way, as they were trying to feel their way out on how this would work best, these are the state legislatures, they had 2 different methods for the most part. And one was considered the at-large method, and this would be basically a voter getting to vote for as many candidates as were eligible to fill the seats in their state. So there were no districts at all in this methodology. You would basically have, say, for example, if a state was allotted 8 representatives, you would be able to choose 8 people who were running on the ticket as a voter. This was called the at-large general election method, and the opposite was the districted elections. And because there were no rules against this at the time, states would often go back and forth between at-large elections and districted elections based on who was in power at the time and what party needed to keep power at the time. A great example of this is in Pennsylvania in the 1790s, where it seems like in each election they flipped from an at-large method to a district method, which basically was just trying to beat the waves of change and maintain power as these positions were flipping in Harrisburg. So both methods were employed as needed. But remember, this is at a time, our early days of our republic, when career politicians really hadn't been anticipated yet. the idea of someone running for House every 2 years in perpetuity was considered not really a threat or a concern. So the idea of voter term limits was not on the table, and the idea of gerrymandering for excessive extended power wasn't on the table either, because these people were basically only going in for short terms. There was much more money to be had in their home professions, and also probably there at the time there was more influence in state politics and local politics as opposed to national politics. So we move along to our namesake here of our lecture today, and this will be Elbridge Gerry, and I am going to pronounce it correctly. It's with a hard G. It has been morphed, of course, into gerrymandering, and there's no known point of time when that did happen. Although we do see flexibility in the definition and the acceptability of the pronunciation. The official version allows either pronunciation. So this man is someone I'd like to introduce you to, a very influential founding father, but also somewhat controversial and not exactly one of our most consistent founding fathers. But among the things Elbridge participated in, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence for Massachusetts. He was a critical and reluctant framer of the Constitution, meaning he was not going along so much with the idea of turning over state power to a federal power. He fought many things along the way at the Constitutional Convention, including, ironically, the direct election of House representatives, which is a bit dumbfounding. At the same time, his patriotic spirit was such that he really distrusted centralized power to the point where it became a bit of an obsession. He drops out of politics more or less after the 1790s. He served as John Adams' liaison in a fairly notorious affair with France known as the XYZ affair. I don't remember which letter Elbridge was. He was one of those letters, but this was a secret mission of diplomacy we won't go into right now, just trying to show you his broad background. Also, after his experience as a diplomat, he drops out of national politics for a period of time until the growing movement of anti-federalists recruit him into the position of a gubernatorial candidate for Massachusetts, and this is in 1810. So during this time, this is at the time, 1810, Elbridge is an elder statesman. He's in his mid-60s. He's considered a very nervous, bird-like individual, somewhat bug-eyed, eccentric, mercurial, meaning he had the ability to just fly off the handle in anger. And he also was known as extremely obstinate. This is a comment by his cohort John Adams, and it's fair to say if John Adams is considering you obstinate, that's probably true, because he was well familiar with obstinacy himself. So, as governor, Elbridge Gerry signs a bill in Massachusetts in February of 1812 that changes the district boundaries in one of the key districts of Massachusetts. And it's changed drastically to the point of becoming a very notorious change. This was noted within a month's time. We had much discussion in Massachusetts regarding this change. It really was unprecedented in its radicalness as far as the boundary twists and turns go. So this truly was a step forward in the creating a gerrymandered district. And the purpose here was to try to ensure that the Democratic Republican Party, the Anti-Federalist Party in Massachusetts, would retain the tenuous hold on power that they did have. This was a attempt by the folks in power to entrench their power, and in the case of the gerrymandering in Massachusetts in 1812, it definitely worked. It was a successful attempt. A result of this election, although the Democrat Republicans gained less than half the popular vote, 49% of the popular vote, they gained 29 of 40 districts thanks to this redrawing of the lines. And so we move ahead to the next slide and we'll see a closer view of the map in question. This is going to be the original gerrymander map. But first, we take a sidestep to Marblehead, Massachusetts, the hometown of Elbridge Gerry, and it's the only place supposedly where they still pronounce the hard G in Gerry. So they're very tough and they're sticking to their old ways there on the coast. And we see a merchant's sign there for Stowaway Sweets. Yes, that is my cousin's location in Marblehead. So we have a personal connection to the hometown of Elbridge Gerry, and I'm sure my cousin really doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to the pronunciation of gerrymandering there, but he sure does care about his chocolate.
But if you're in Marblehead, go to Stowaway Sweets for fine candy.
There you go.
This program was sponsored by Stowaway Sweets.
Unpaid sponsors. We love it. So we move ahead to the map itself that brings all the attention to Marblehead and to Elbridge Gerry. And this is the map. This is the combination of the Elbridge Gerry mechanisms with the salamander looking district. So the Gerry and the salamander become the Gerrymander, which of course becomes the gerrymander, simply by a mispronunciation. And you do see this strange looking district. I can't say I've seen many salamanders that look like that, but it's certainly a dramatic change to the prior districting methods. And right away, this map was released in local newspapers. I believe the Boston Daily Advertiser was the first one to publish this in March of 1812. And right away, speculation began as to who produced the map, who was the brains behind it, who was the artist behind it. And that is a question that remained unknown for quite some time. About 100 years or so, this was a bit of a mystery. The person most often credited with devising this particular map is our next slide, a very famous painter in American history. His name is Gilbert Stuart. He is the painter of that unfinished George Washington painting you see in your lower right-hand corner. And this is a very interesting person to study all by himself. A struggling artist, even into his successful years, for a variety of reasons. But it was assumed that Gilbert, who had a connection with the Federalists of the Massachusetts area, he had a connection with many of the editors and publishers of the local newspapers. It was believed that he was commissioned to produce this. And even some current histories credit him as the originator of the original gerrymander map. However, further research has not proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, but pretty much proven that the actual author, the actual artist behind the original gerrymander map was the next man we will meet. And his name, a much more obscure figure in American art history. His name is Elkanah Tisdale, a self-described engraver. He was born and raised in Connecticut. He had several businesses with regards to engraving and wood cutting for print. And it is firmly believed now that Elkanah Tisdale was the person responsible for the artistry that became known as the gerrymander map. Apparently, and I'm not sure if this is true, but there is one reference to the fact that the original wood blocks that were cut by Mr. Tisdale still are in the possession of the Library of Congress to this day, which would be pretty cool to know. And also ironic is the fact that the founder or the originator of the idea for the Library of Congress was none other than Elbridge Gerry, a person who's being opposed by Tisdale and his politics, being that he's working for the Federalist at this time, producing this propaganda. So we move from Elkanah, but we pay attention to the word gerrymander at this point. It's still pronounced gerrymander, I believe, at this point. This man you're looking at right here, Nathan Hale Sr., is considered the most likely source for the popularity and the widespread use of the term gerrymander. Hale was widely connected throughout New England, owned more than one newspaper. He was the owner of the Boston Daily Advertiser and also was a founding publisher of the North American Review. So a very influential Federalist for sure. Also the nephew of the original Nathan Hale, we may remember from New York City revolutionary days, who regretted he had but one life to give for his country. So we meet his nephew here, who was fighting for his cause, the Federalist cause, by printing as much propaganda as he could regarding the monstrous gerrymander. Now, let me just read a little bit about what the newspaper said about the gerrymander. There's a couple of interesting little quotes. The district may well be exhibited to be a monster. It is the offspring of moral and political depravity. It was created to drown the real voice of the majority of the citizens of the county of Essex, where it is well known there is a large federal majority. It is an anti-republican monster engendered in conclave during the last session of the General Court with a desire to secure power to a few ambitious men. And it goes on, the monster was born amidst, quote, many fiery ebullitions of party spirit, many explosions of democratic wrath, and fulminations of gubernatorial vengeance within the year past, end quote. So along with the visual propaganda, we have plenty of verbal propaganda to coincide with this new political propaganda tool known as the gerrymander. So we'll take a brief aside at the moment, and we'll look a little bit at gerrymandering through history. So Michelle will be on rapid fire, and we will present to you how it spread from Nathan Hale's newspapers in the 1820s, teens, 20s, 30s, throughout not just our country, but throughout the world. Here we see our first example. This is Gustavus Henry Sr., who was connected to a political machine in Tennessee. And when his political maneuverings ousted then State Senator Andrew Johnson, who we meet later, post-Lincoln, when Johnson was ousted due to Henry's maneuverings, he was accused of Henrymandering by the Nashville Union newspaper. We move on to the next. We meet California Governor Jerry Brown. This is a more recent event. We're talking about the 1970s, where his maneuverings earned him the correctly pronounced title of the Gerrymanderer. We move on to Texas, 1990s, 2000s. Here he is, Rick Perry, accused of Perrymandering, amazingly. And then we have to throw in someone we don't have a picture for next. His name is James Tully. He was an Irish politician in the 1990s, accused of Tullymandering. And now we meet the strangest one of all. This is a conservative Australian politician from about 30, 40 years ago. His name, next slide, please, John Bajelka Peterson. Yes, indeed, accused of Bajelka-mandering. And he looks like he's having fun doing it. So very, very, very widespread use of the mander here, as we're seeing. This is all through the world. This is throughout history. It's a catchy phrase, as we see. It's used to throw the dirt at the opponent, and we see examples in history thusly. So we'll take a break now from the lighter side, And if Michelle can revert perhaps to a picture of the map, or maybe someone other than, yes, the map would be just perfect. There we go. Gary would be good too. There we go. That one right there would be perfect. We're going to do a little bit of a timeline of gerrymandering before we meet the more recent perpetrators. So we've covered our period up through the gerrymandering of Massachusetts in the 18 teens. We move forward though to a change in the stylings of Congress, and this was in the period around 1840. Gerrymandering was, like I said, not widely employed before 1840 because we didn't have career politicians. We didn't have those kinds of power grabs quite as necessary. We also didn't have very strongly functioning parties yet. That was coming on through the 1830s with the Jacksonian Democrats, followed by Martin Van Buren. So what they did, what the Democrats were doing in the 1830s is they were trying to consolidate power by changing the rules of states districting. And then when the economy tanked in the late 1830s, while Van Buren was president, the Democrats' chances for reelection also tanked with that. So the setup for the Democrats that they thought they were setting up for themselves ended up being a setup for their opponents, the Whigs, who had nominated William Henry Harrison as president in 1840. And so we have a period where Harrison's president for only a month. His vice president takes over. It's John Tyler, who isn't really a Whig. He's elected by the Whigs as VP, but he's really a former Democrat who ends up shattering the Whig Party and thus shattering the mechanisms of Congress at this time. So what Congress has to do, and this is a Congress controlled by Whigs, is they have to come up with a way to retain whatever power they can because their party is disintegrating. They come up with the 1842 Apportionment Act, which is very important because it mandates the single member district. This eliminates the at-large way of voting. So this was thought to be a way to take some control back and take it out of the whimsical year by year changes. This was some sense of like we may lose a little in the short term, but we're going to have one method now to elect single members only to the districts. Some states do not comply with this until a few years later, when it's apparent that both parties would benefit from some stability in the system. So by the mid 1840s, it's now 100% throughout the country. It's a single member district. This is further codified in 1967 under something called the Uniform Congressional Districting Act. But what happens during this period, 1840 to 1896, is very significant. Of course, the Civil War plays a big role in the middle of that. But gerrymandering is growing through the 1840s and 50s as you have these newspapers playing a bigger role in influencing, as we saw in the Gustavus Henry case in Tennessee. And we also see a really huge growth in the gerrymander post-Civil War. And this is directly related to Reconstruction. And it's really focusing in the South, most of these gerrymander effects. And this is a result of both parties being competitive nationally, meaning that you have active Republican and Democratic parties building up and increased loyalty to those parties. And you have states where you may have Democrats taking over from Republicans and then vice versa in the next election cycle. You have a lot of turnover and state competitions at this time. Partisan loyalties are firm. Voter turnout is very, very high. So it's an effective and it's essential at this time, even to some, to have really vigorous gerrymandering. It's literally done to keep control, and it's done in very, very different ways, both from a bipartisan point of view and from a partisan point of view, meaning the gerrymandering is going against the other party. We will see an example later in history where bipartisan gerrymandering actually helps both parties stay in place. It's not against each other. There's a huge period of history where this has happened, but at this time, it's partisan gerrymandering. It's power grabbing. Now, it sounds like today. The period in this post-Civil War to 1896 sounds a lot like today, and there are similarities in the partisanship. What is different, though, there are some key differences. One is that we now have a one-person, one-vote standard that was put in place by the Supreme Court in the early 60s. So there's less flexibility to maneuver districts in some ways. Also, more states were, like I said just a minute ago, two-party competitive. You had power flipping between the parties. Today, states are far more predictable, and there's less of that changing hands. And you also have a huge federal government today, which didn't exist in this Reconstruction period. It was certainly growing, but it wasn't quite the spoils of a jackpot that it is today. So there's more to grab for, I guess, is one way to put that. And we do see examples of these bizarre districts, meaning, they're still being creative with the pen. One example is something they called the Boa Constrictor District of South Carolina. This was 1882, where literally they drew a narrow set of lines around all eligible black voters, and it ended up being just a snake that went through the middle of the state. And it was not only considered legal, but it was also, the way I looked at it, it was remarkable because this shows you that it wasn't really quite yet full Jim Crow. They were certainly marginalizing and limiting, the black representation, yet they were still allowing voting to happen in 1882 in South Carolina in some places. So, things got worse after that, I would say. Better off gerrymandered than not allowed to vote at all or killed. But we have this change happen in 1896, of course. This is the growth of the Republican stronghold on the federal government, meaning it's mostly the presidency from here on out. We also have increasing number of states that are being taken over by one party. So you have less of that intrastate competition, and you have more like solid states going one way or the other. Also, very important, we talked about this during our last visit, the House stops expanding in 1911. So every 10 years when they had to do redistricting due to growth, that mandate stopped with the end of the growth of the numbers in the House. So that allowed for many more districts to remain stable starting at around this period, 1910. In fact, we have two really, really strong examples, both from the Republican camp and the Democrat camp. The Republicans controlled Connecticut for a long period of time. And it was a 50-year period between around 1910 to 1960, 65, somewhere in there, where they never changed the map. The map was exactly the same for a 50-year plus period. And the same happened in Louisiana with the Democrats in control, pretty much that same time period, 1910 to 1965 or so. Now, again, the changes start happening in the mid-60s because of the Supreme Court stepping in. The Supreme Court at that time decided that malapportionment was becoming a severe problem. And malapportionment was highlighted in this period throughout the 50s into the 60s by an increase of rural dominated representation that wasn't backed by the numbers. The numbers were going to the city and suburbs, and yet rural representation was disproportionately strong, and that simply fell into the way they were drawing districts. As the population changed, the districts hadn't been changed, so it became obvious that something had to be done. Court cases came up at this time, one from Georgia, in particular, where the Supreme Court agreed with the petitioner that indeed his vote was tampered with, basically by the Georgia state legislature. So this feeling by the Supreme Court at this time was very much that they had a right to step in when states were not sticking up for the one person, one vote mandate that they had supported. This was called the reapportionment revolution. This starting in this early 1960s period. But what's interesting too is at the same time, these court decisions come in, and this is mandating changes for a lot of states. Um, with other civil rights developments during the 60s, what happened to the parties is really important in the 60s. The parties started to disintegrate in a way. It was called the de-alignment movement, where people started to do things like split their ticket, meaning I'm going to vote for a Republican senator, but I'm going to vote for the Democratic candidate for president, and similar splits. You're voting for a Democratic governor, but you're voting for a Republican congressional candidate. So that was a growing trend through the 60s into the 70s and 80s. And that's what I remember growing up. I remember a lot of split tickets. I remember the parties had less control, and the character, it was the person, it was the personality that seemed to draw people one way or the other, not so much the parties. And this is very much connected to another development during this time, and it's something I hadn't really realized, because I guess I always assumed gerrymandering was one party versus another, one party, but this is a different version. This is the growth of bipartisan gerrymandering, and it's been described as an incumbent protection racket. And you see some examples of this where things were so unknown in the voting public. Could vote Democrat, could vote Republican. Polls didn't have the same influence as they do today. So gerrymandering had no purpose. You couldn't gerrymander unknown voters. Gerrymandering only works when it's a solid voting public. So gerrymandering thrown into tizzy by the independent voting cycle of this period. So the members of both parties get together to redraw maps to protect themselves. And some of the numbers from this period are incredible. There's a period of time, I think it's the 1980s, study by the Brennan Law Center in New York City showed that in New York during this 10-year period, more incumbents died in office than lost elections, which to me is remarkable and notable. And this is I guess the bipartisanship that I remember growing up. That was part of it. This is why we had more stability in a sense. I'm not saying it was the best system, but it was certainly less volatile. And bipartisanship seemed to at least have a thought about getting things done and accomplishing the work of Congress rather than name calling. So that leads us to our next slide as we get into things like name calling and extreme partisanship. And no, that's not the man. No, we're going to go the other way now. Our next slide, here he is. There he is. We don't need any labels for him. Everyone knows who this man is. The House takeover in the mid-90s, led by Mr. Gingrich, where you have the beginning of the impeachment trials against Clinton. You have again, far more dollars flooding into elections at this time, people trying to by-election cycles. And then we have a heavy, steady decline at this period in competitive districts, as well as a heavy decline in split ticket voting. One stat that I saw comes in a little bit past Newt here, but it's truly a remarkable stat. It was comparing George Bush 2004 and his voting trends to Trump in 2020. Bush in 2004, out of the 3,000 plus counties in the United States, had under 200 counties where he had an 80% plus landslide. And Trump in 2020 had almost 700 of those counties where he had an 80% plus landslide. So again, a fine example of less competition And basically these are, I know these are counties and not districts. I do understand that, but it still is indicative of the trends in voting. We also we had the new plan of polarization and non-cooperation, really enhanced by the next person we'll see here. This is the exterminator. Remember the exterminator? Next slide, please. It's yes, he is. Oh, he's laughing. He thinks it's funny that he's getting his mugshot taken. There's Tom DeLay. He was Newt's lieutenant who pretty much took over and has some interesting quotes from this period of time. I came across one where Mr. DeLay said, this is in 2000, I'm the majority leader and I want more seats. And he got 6 seats in the next election. So again, this is just a political strong arming and blackmailing and all of these things. Of course, this mugshot was taken after he left office, but nothing ever became of this. His conviction was overturned or thrown out. So no penalties for Tom, but kind of the penalty ends up being like the entire voting populace ends up getting penalized with leadership such as his. So again, we see this degeneration starting in 94. This is another really interesting stat. Okay, this is not to do with the House, this is the Senate. But in 1980, almost half the states, I think it was 23 states out of 50, had one Republican and one Democratic senator. Today, 6. So another example of the failure of bipartisanship, and this is a new kind of polarized gerrymandering that's taking place. Of course, computer algorithms play a huge role in the redrawing of the maps these days. One of the most notorious redrawing efforts was the 2008 red map plan by the Republicans to take over state legislatures, which was very, very effective. And it definitely led to repercussions that we're experiencing to this day. There was actually an attempt in 2017 by a representative from Maryland by the name of John Delaney, who ran for president in 2020. I missed that. He must have dropped out pretty quickly because I don't remember him running. But he proposed the Open Our Democracy Act of 2017. And it's a fascinating read. I believe it's still on the books, although he is no longer seated as a Maryland representative. But looking up the current status of it, it didn't say dismissed or withdrawn. It's still somewhere floating out there. But this idea, the 2017 idea by John Delaney, would effectively end all legislative gerrymandering by sending everything to a commission. And it would also, very importantly, create a federal election day, which I've said before I'm a big fan of. So again, we see hope with these kind of proposals, and yet this has been pretty much ignored and shoved aside to continue the business as usual plan, unfortunately. So we'll move forward and we'll get into a couple of the more recent Supreme Court cases. We're going to talk about a case from, I think it started in 2016. 2016, it begins on the state level, and it ends up combining several cases together. And it originates in North Carolina. It's called Rucho versus Common Cause. The final decision came down in 2019. And I'm not sure if this is exactly as the court was in 2019. I don't exactly remember the dates of our most recent folks. I know, of course, it's prior to Trump, so it's a little bit different today. But again, this is a decision where in North Carolina, we had a citizen allege map violation. Basically, it was an incorrect map that was found to be by lower court to be illegal. made its way up to the higher courts, and finally, when the Supreme Court looked at it, they threw it out. They, again, like they've been doing more recently, consistently, anything that falls into a political gerrymandering category, they feel that it's none of their business, that this goes back to the 10th Amendment argument, which basically says anything not specifically, explicitly written down in the Constitution is reserved to the states. All of the rights not explicit are reserved to the states. We've heard this argument for almost everything, from abortion to cannabis to you name it. And in this case, we had a 5-4 decision, and the minority dissent was written by Elena Kagan, who we will see a close-up of, I believe, next, if Michelle's ready with that. No, that's the wrong way. There's the right way. There she is. And I want to read what she wrote about this because I think it's very relevant, and I think it's chastising her fellow judges, and she's trying to point out what the Supreme Court's role really can be and should be. And she finds it disturbing, of course, that the majority tends to throw these cases back. Now, the cases they don't throw back are racial gerrymandering cases. Even the conservative courts have mostly allowed for changes when challenges have been made along racial lines. And we will actually hear about a case that just came down last week regarding that. But this is going back a few years, and I'm going to read what Justice Elena Kagan said about this case. The decision to sidestep the case ignores the violation of, quote, the most fundamental of constitutional rights, the rights to participate equally in the political process, to join with others to advance political beliefs, and to choose their political representatives, encouraging politics of polarization and dysfunction that may irreparably damage our system of government. Of all times to abandon the court's duty to declare the law, this was not the one. The practices challenged in these cases imperil our system of government. Part of the court's role in that system is to defend its foundations. None is more important than free and fair elections. With respect, but deep sadness, I dissent. Very well put. And I also would like to point out we have a kind of a bit of a change here that might actually lead to something positive for the future. We see in California an interesting example of how progress has moved forward and maybe is setting a precedent for the rest of the country to follow. And the story goes like this. In 2000, in California, a bipartisan legislative body, a commission made up by the leaders of both parties, drew a congressional map presumably for the next 10 years, that was one of the most incumbent-friendly maps in history. This map, at one point, one of the years they were reviewing in this 10-year period from 2000 to 2010, one of the years had 153 competitive elections up that year with one loss to the incumbent. So this was one of those moments in history that got enough citizen attention in California that in 2008, a referendum was put up to the voters to ask whether they would like to create a non-competitive bipartisan commission that's taken out of the hands of the legislators and given to this permanent commission. The citizens said, yes, we want that. And in 2010, it was up and running. And it's known as the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. And supposedly, now I'm not sure on the numbers or anything, but supposedly the result of this redoing of the map by a nonpartisan commission, the result is California has become the most competitive state for these seats in the nation. So if it's competition we're looking for, then this would be a way to go. We have currently about 10 states with various forms of either a commission, a study group to look at a commission, and such. I know Hawaii and Alaska are in there. New Jersey has one, but only for congressional races. They have an independent commission, supposedly. Utah, Colorado, Michigan falls into the same field, Arizona. There's a few others, but notably, none are from the South, with the possible exception of Virginia. Virginia, I'm not sure what I was coming across from Virginia, but they may have one of these independent commissions as well. But so you see a trend. This is a growing trend. Unfortunately, though, opposed to that trend is more entrenchment in places like North Carolina. North Carolina possibly is the most heinous of all of the states currently. There's some, it's shenanigans at a very high level. There's a district in North Carolina, the 12th district. It's called the I-85 district because it's literally only as wide as the highway is in a few sections to make it convenient. And again, North Carolina is the birthplace of that Rucho versus Common Cause lawsuit. So again, North Carolina has earned a reputation at the forefront of the shenanigan world. But very recently, we have two stories, and I'm going to start with the one from North Dakota. North Dakota's story comes in this past Friday, so Friday, November 19th. A U.S. district judge uphold a complaint that claimed that Native American voting rights were violated as per the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And this, again, not the word racial wasn't explicitly used in this article, but I believe this would be a connection to the general rule that anything that smacks of racial redistricting and gerrymandering must be stricken down and redone. Again, I'm not officially sure this was the judge's wording, but it seems to fall under that case. And of course, these always get appealed. So, when you see the reaction of the defendants and the complainants, it's all, the people who lost in North Dakota, they're not acting like they lost. And the people that won, they're hopeful, but they're not sure they really won because it's, again, always in flux. Perhaps a more important case for the entire country, and I'm going to spend a little time on this one, comes in from New York State, and this is from Wednesday, November 17th, the most recent word I've gotten on this case. The article I'm going to quote from is November 11th from Politico. The writer of this article is Stephen Shepard. And he reports on a case in New York State that the Court of Appeals is hearing. That is an appeal by a Democratic group that's trying to allow a commission to redraw the map of New York. The map they used last time produced several Republican victories, especially in Long Island. And the Democrats are not directly seeking to rewrite the map, but they're seeking to see if a commission will approve of a rewriting of the map, which will almost certainly allow for the elimination of several Republican seats through gerrymandering, and mostly in Long Island. And one of the seats they're working on eliminating is the seat of this man right here on our next slide. Indeed, it's George. That would be a really easy way to just get rid of this guy, is just pretend his district never existed. Just kind of erase that one. Okay, this way we don't have to worry about all the time we're going to waste talking about him. Unfortunately, though, as wonderful as that sounds, to have George Santos preempted from being a public figure in that way, as much as that appeals to me, I have to say that to go along with that sentiment, I have to support extreme and seemingly shenanigan-based gerrymandering. In other words, the only way to fight this kind of power grabbing is to power grab. So whoever you're supporting a power grab, it seems. The only non-power grab methodology that I can come across, of course, is these centralized commissions. But again, it doesn't really always work that way either. And the reason I'm saying that is in New York, what it comes down to is, and this is a very important case for one very obvious reason. It's the fact that if the Democrats are successful, they will not only add 6 Democratic seats to the House, but it would flip the House by 1 seat, because North Carolina is doing this for the Republicans currently. They've flipped 3 seats, or they're guaranteeing to flip 3. So this would double the flip of North Carolina and change the makeup of the House. So it's a big one. And what's very interesting to me is it's a 9-person commission on this Court of Appeals, or 9-person group. And one person is different than the group that voted it down last time. There was a woman who since stepped down. She was the deciding vote. She was kind of neither a Republican or Democrat, kind of an independent, voted with the Republicans to not allow this last time. She has stepped down. Someone else has been appointed who has recused herself from this case, and I don't know why. So there's now a temporary appointee in this 9th position, the deciding vote, to decide whether the Democrats will get to rewrite their own seats and put a likely 1-person majority into our House of Representatives. This seems like an awful lot of power that's put into the hands of this one woman who I don't know who she is even. I did see her name once and I didn't write it down, and it's gone now. She might be in hiding now, because this is a very, very important decision for the whole country that I think most people would have a hard time really understanding. So we move towards the conclusion here, and I really have to conclude with this graph. This is an example of the risk of the rig map. Okay, so these are high risk states, low risk states. You see the green is at the very bottom, and no risk, and then the high red is the extreme risk. You can see most of the extreme risk is south of the Mason-Dixon line, but we have plenty of Midwestern representatives. Looks like the entire Ohio, Indiana, the Dakotas, Minnesota, sure, high risk throughout. And this is because these are the states that have legislative redistricting allowed. This is when you see Arizona, California, Idaho. Well, I don't know about Utah. That's showing red. I thought they had a commission, but they may have had the commission to study the commission, and they may have tossed that out already. So again, these are your dangerous states for rigging things. Very interesting map, and I believe we'll have another graph coming up. Is that correct? Yes, this is the graph. This is basically showing the simplest way on how these lines can be changed to change the districting. You can see the way the lines are going straight up and down on the top square. And on the bottom one, by wiggling the line this way and that way, you change your districts completely. You change your representation completely. All of a sudden, there's a different breakdown, and it's only in the line drawing that allows this. You have the same amount of voters, the same amount of population, and you just have creative line drawing creating new realities. And so this was the easiest way to show how this works with simple creative artistry. But we're going to go to the last image now. This is the one I just added on very late in the game. This might be the most ridiculous district ever created in U.S. history. And we're going to talk about it just a little bit right now. This is a district that no longer exists. It's the 7th Congressional District in Pennsylvania. This would be the very bottom of the map there would be Pennsylvania, the northern suburbs of Pennsylvania, going up to Lancaster, Amish country. And this is a map that it's called the Goofy Kicking Donald Duck map. This is literally the name of this map. And you can see the images are pretty close. You can see Goofy kind of hugging Donald there, but images I've seen really show a cartoon comparison that's almost identical to this picture. This was drawn to protect the Republican congressman, and you can see the greater area that it covers there: western Philadelphia, northern suburbs, all the way up into the Amish country. A woman who lives in Chester, Pennsylvania, a retiree named Beth Lawn, said she was tired of living in Goofy's middle finger. This is a quote now from the New York Times, January 2018. The reporter's name is Trip Gabriel. Quote, "At the point on the map where Goofy's foot contacts Donald Duck's rump, the district is precisely as wide as the Brandywine Hospital." Okay, that would be the lower part of the screen. And the upper part on the right, the very narrow part where you can see Goofy's neck is, that area is actually a steak and seafood restaurant parking lot. And the width of the district at that point is literally the parking lot width. And the restaurant itself has become kind of or at the time became a ground zero kind of place where people would meet to try to get this changed. So when they would go around the neighborhood to get petitions signed to get the districts changed, they were finding that literally next door neighbors had different representatives. And everyone you asked had a different idea on what was going on there. Some people thought, oh, across the street, that's a different district. It might have been a different county, but not a different district. It was just complete chaos, and it became a laughingstock. And the Pennsylvania High Court did strike this one down as, I believe this was 2019, as just too extreme. I don't know beyond that. I don't know what became of it. I don't know if there's other Disney characters now represented in Pennsylvania, but just how to throw this in as an example, an extreme example of what gerrymandering looks like, and what we can do to change it. And again, the easiest description of what we're talking about is power grabbing. That's what we're talking about. Even the words used to describe the types of power grabbing, these are literally types of gerrymandering. There's cracking, which is diluting the opposition by creating many districts where you're just carving up all the votes. Then there's packing. So you can pack a district and you can crack a district. If you pack a district, you're putting all of the constituents into one district. All the one side goes into one district with crazy lines, and this way they only get that one seat, and then everything else goes to the other party. This is what happened in the 1882 boa constrictor picture in South Carolina. There's also hijacking, which is changing boundaries to have two incumbents square off against each other to knock one of them off. And then the fourth one is kidnapping. So this is a terrible lineup of cracking, packing, hijacking, and kidnapping. Kidnapping is changing the incumbent's home address to a different district, just changing a district around the incumbent's address. Now he's in a different district. This has happened and will happen as long as it's allowed to happen. What ends this is a national commission on redistricting. And it could be, you could use algorithms and you could use computers to create pretty exact and fair maps, but is fairness what we want? It might be what we want, but is it what the powers that be wants? And if you can just get anything out of this presentation today, we see the cycles, we see positive changes, but we also see the same old. We see, again, most of these changes not coming from our southern states, and they're pretty much happy to have the districts, reflect their need for power. So I'm ready to open the floor up for anything. And again, it's been a pleasure. I hope it made sense, and I hope you learned something.
Now you've made us all even more depressed. This is why Chuck doesn't like to do these presentations. Although, I like your idea. I like your solution. I think it's a great one. Um, I mean, I know that other people are going to come out with this, so I'm just going to open up the floor to this discussion because I know a lot of people out there feel the same way that I do, and that is that you know it's kind of like fighting fire with fire. I mean, the power grab. I mean, that's what's happening if you play nice. I mean, you get left behind. Um,
Mhm.
and there's a lot at stake here. So anyway, unmute yourself or put it in the chat and chat away, Tom.
Yeah, that's the way. I mean, as you put your fingers right on the pulse of it, is that when you feel that the other side is cheating, then you're more willing to allow your own side to cheat because you feel that you're just leveling the playing field in that sense. And also that what you have here is such hatred, as you pointed out, because you don't have like those split tickets anymore. You have such hatred and such partisanship and such hostility to the other side that you're fine with gerrymandering because you're fine with cheating because as long as your side is winning,
Right.
it's fine because there's such a hatred for the other side. You're like, well, because you made a point. You said, we all want to see fairness. I think a lot of people don't. I think a lot of people they so despise the other side of the political spectrum that they're like, well, if we got to cheat to keep them out, I'm fine with it.
Yes, and then you come across somebody like John Delaney, who I'll say again, I never heard of until doing this research. And he seems like a pretty moderate Democrat, someone who's just kind of, trying to get something accomplished with a greater goal in mind for the citizens. And it's notable how ignored this idea was. Looking back, even at the press releases, I mean, this is just not an attention grabber. The idea of a national election day, the idea of a centralized national commission to do districting lines, didn't even get a blink. Again, that's what's most surprising. Like a groundswell towards that kind of idea would actually be effective, and yet people seem locked into their partisanship in a way. I don't know what creates mass movements towards moderates. I don't think that really happens because they're not dynamic. They're often fence sitters or wafflers or you know people who are trying to dance on both sides of the aisle. It's really not always that. It's simply that they're trying to get stuff done. They're trying to do things for the greater good for the greater number of people, and it's increasingly a difficult tread.
Jen, did you have a comment? Jen, you want to unmute yourself?
No, not really. I always knew there was gerrymandering going on, but with Chuck's presentation today, it's like just so stunning to me that it's going on. And thank goodness there are some people who are aware of it and doing something about it,
Mm-hmm.
Because this can slip by and just get really out of hand if someone isn't watching them.
I agree. I think also what happens in our system is that there's always another election right around the corner. So we tend to lose focus on what just happened because all of a sudden there's a sweep into the next one that kind of lets us forget some about what just happened. And then because that's always the cycle, we don't really fix things very well because we're so focused on what's coming next. No one wants to look back and try to go through the details and work on all the little. Most people really don't have the patience for that. It's easier to forget all that and move forward, but then you're moving forward with all of that baggage with you, with more problems ahead, most likely.
If they wanted to, could the Supreme Court solve this?
Yes, they could, I believe. Of course, it would take a different Supreme Court makeup to do so. But we look at the early 60s decisions that didn't just limit their restrictions on gerrymandered maps to racially motivated changes. They went beyond just race in 62 and 64. So they can, in theory, they have the power to put more teeth into some sort of a federalized kind of, or at least a minimum standard type federalized system where it may not look the same in every state, but at least there would be limits on how far they can go, how far states can claim this is just a political gerrymander and get away with it. That's really what I think Elena Kagan was saying in her dissent. She was saying that, no, this is beyond politics. And even if it is politics, you can't use that as a limitation on your decisions because the destruction is too severe. You can go back to your 10th Amendment arguments in some cases, but this is affecting everybody. It's like it's separate but equal. It's kind of like that. You can let your states do their education independently until they're relying on separate but equal. That's not equal but extremely separate. That's when the Fed stepped in and said, no, we have to have some sort of standardization because the states aren't taking care of their own job. That's how I would describe it.
Dan, did you have a question?
No, I was going to say, I think the attitude is by any means necessary. And that's just the way it is. If we need to get into power, whether it's the Supreme Court or in Congress, by any means necessary, and that's anything goes. And that's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. It's very uncivil for one thing, and it attracts the wrong kind of people into politics. The wrong kind of egomaniac, attention getters are the ones that could maneuver in that kind of field. And here's another example that I found very notable, going back to the period when I was a young kid being exposed to politics for the first time. I mentioned my exposure to the idea of a split ticket. I was aware of that as a kid, and I knew the adults in my life often did not vote always Democratic. They were mostly Democratic, but they didn't like some Democratic candidates. They wouldn't hesitate to vote for a Republican if they were upstanding and represented their beliefs. That's part of it. Also, from the politicians themselves, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, possibly into the 90s even, you had many, many liberal Republicans. The state that I'm in right now, Oregon, had 2 Republicans as senators for many years, Mark Hatfield, Bob Packwood. Not going to defend them on their personal life, but they defended the environment. These are Republicans who put their life, their reputation on the line to defend things like Earth Day. That's not going to happen today. You don't have that kind of crossover happening today. So again, to me, that was a sign of a more functional political system when Republicans didn't lose their seat because they came out in favor of reducing coal emissions, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and likewise, you have certain politicians that are in safe districts, and no matter what they do, they don't care because they will always be voted in again.
Yes. There's an example from, again, right here in Oregon. I'd like to bring this up as a sign of the changing times. Our representative for many, many years since I got to Oregon in the late 90s was a man named Peter DeFazio, a Democratic House leader by the end of his career. He was in charge of committees and he had some clout. And what always struck me about Peter DeFazio is that when he was running in his early congressional career in our area, and I live in a very rural county, it's dominated by timber industry, fisheries, and tourism, more so nowadays. But again, it's a resource-based economy. Peter DeFazio would win elections with no opposition from Republicans in a Republican county. He would win 85% of the vote, and including Republican votes, because he was doing the right thing for the people of this county. Now, in his last 3 or 4 elections, and he's since retired recently, but in his last 3 or 4 elections, the gap was closing dramatically on his victories. He kept winning, but he was winning by less and less, and Republicans started putting up candidates against him, extremely, vitriolic. And all of a sudden, like we just saw in our little county, a microcosm of a lot of the rest of the country. And his last election, he barely won, and he just decided it was getting too ugly for him. But that's my example again. Is it's hard to find a Peter DeFazio example of today, a member of either party who's been there a long time, who gets a predominance of votes from both parties in his district. That's hard to find today.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about too many years ago. This is only 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and the future doesn't look bright either.
No, but I'll look at it this way. I prefer to look at it this way. I believe that the experiment known as the United States of America, it's kind of a miracle that we're still here talking about it in some ways. You know, we've been through so much, and we are going through so much all the time. I kind of look at it like we could always try to make it better, and we should, but we can't stop appreciating it for the uniqueness that it gives to the world. It's a very unique experiment, and I know it's quite dysfunctional. At the same time, I'm still attracted to the ideals of it, and I think that the freedoms we still have within that exist and should be celebrated. We can't be too upset or depressed about some of these realities, because there's a bigger picture, I think, that's actually not so bad.
I think we should end there, to be honest, before we go down the slippery slope.
Before the happy pills wear off. Yes. Okay.
Thanks,
For that.
Chuck.
That was the most positive, upbeat, thing I've ever heard you say, really.
It's possible. I've been working on it.
I twisted his arm to do this. I really did.
On a more negative note, though,
That's normal.
Because with your understanding of the various different, you talked today like about Monroe and Patrick Henry and Madison and so on. Just what do you think, if we could rustle them up to come today and to ask their opinion of something like, and we've always had oddballs and eccentrics in politics, but what do you think they would have made of a George Santos or a Lauren Boebert and her theater going days and such? I mean, what do you think they would have made of some of the characters we have? Has there ever been any period in time where we had anything like these type of individuals, these kind of jackasses and buffoons and clowns?
The answer is yes, we have. The reason that it's kind of not known is because not everything was filmed and recorded and paid so much attention to in the older days. There's some crazy stories going back, for the whole 200 plus years of our history that they're buried in history books, but because they didn't go viral, we think it didn't happen so much back then. But I contest that it did. I mean, we had duels in the Senate, right? We had the guy hitting the other guy with the cane. Preston Brooks gets smashed in the head or smashes the other guy in the head. Sumner in the Senate in 1856. We've had really some nasty periods. I mean, think of dueling. I mean, think of the concept of
Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton.
Exactly. Now, a recent idea, a friend and I were kind of joking about is, you can have like a duel off of the representatives until you're down to the best two, the final two. They could just knock each other off in like a round robin or some sort of like, NCAA basketball tournament type event. But of course, that's not going to happen. But there is no real kind of change that we're going to see for the foreseeable future, though. It's going to continue the way we have our sensationalized world of today, sensationalized everything. It's just going to attract more of those people. There's no way a calm figure is going to come in, and not in this cycle. Maybe that's the next cycle after, some more stuff blows away and, you get down to the reality again. But for the time being, the sad part is it's attracting all the wrong people now. I really do feel that. I remember reading something a few years ago that it was more of a psychological study of politicians, and it was really comparing like the narcissism and the egomaniacs of today. There's never been that before. I mean, you had elements of that with your Roscoe Conklings, but imagine Roscoe Conkling today. Like, would he ever not be tweeting? Like, would he ever not be posting photos of his plumed hat? It's just, we're the product of our times to a degree. And it's just sad that it's producing such a low quality of leadership. And that it's really what it is. I see quality leadership in my life very infrequently, but I do see it and I note it. But all the people that I note in those positions are not the types to go out into a public position and be a larger leader. They're quiet and steady and good in their local zone, and that's probably as far.
Yeah, I can go for. I can go for. I can do this.
Yeah.
Well, that was a question from someone. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Chuck. I think you may have come up with your next talk, or your 2-3 talks from now, but pairing like some shenanigans, in history, like you could match someone up against, someone else.
The other problem is that the good people don't want to run for these high offices because look at what goes on. I mean, it's like you feel like you're hitting a wall. It's crazy.
Like George,
Yes, and the public scrutiny, here, think about it this way, okay? The public scrutiny involved in becoming a politician. Okay, I go back to the example of Gary Hart, Democratic candidate for president, I want to say about 1980, 84, somewhere in there. The Dukakis era of Democratic politics. And he was knocked out of the primary for an affair or something that was revealed or something. I don't even remember what it was, but it was a personal life thing that derailed his complete political career. He was out of politics after that for the most part. And I'm comparing that to George Santos. Like, what knocked Gary Hart out shouldn't have, even at the time, but how did he avoid vetting? I mean, even his own party members were shocked when all of this was revealed about his real life. I mean, that's
some people knew stuff. I mean, I heard things were published about him before he won that election. I have no idea why the opposition didn't use it.
It's strange, but partly it might be because there's not much that's really secret these days. It's a matter of what you really want to pay attention to. And if you're just bedazzled by George Santos and his nice shiny hair and the way he talks and all the things he says, then you don't really care about the truth in some cases. I mean, this is the Trump syndrome. It doesn't really matter if you're so enamored with the personality. The substance is irrelevant, absolutely irrelevant. It doesn't matter. You're just taken in by this personality, and that's increasingly what we see in our political spectrum. And it's not new. It goes back. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was a personality for sure, but again, before massive media attention, you had to be a little bit more realistic, or perhaps a little bit more, down to earth. I'm not sure what the word is, but again, the Santos phenomenon, even today, that's like, I don't get it. I just don't get it.
I think, Chuck, there's an attitude that it's like the Democrats play nice and the Republicans will be dirty if they have to be. It's like somebody bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Yes.
And it's not fair, and that's why you lose, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, something, I think both parties play pretty lousy these days.
They do. And they've also, remembered the other part of the story is they've locked it in. So there's no other parties we're going to be talking about anytime soon. The way they've set it up with signature requirements and gathering and registration, it's set up to be a permanent forever and ever 2-party system, just like it's set up to be 435 House members. Even if we have 9 billion people in our country, we're just going to have less representation. It just seems to be the power grab setup these days. Now, looking back in history, like I always do, we had periods in our history, 1890s to say the 1930s, we had a vibrant 3rd and 4th party system going. We had blocks of representatives who were from the Farmer Labor Party in the Midwest that actually controlled votes. They controlled the way apportionment bills went because there were enough of them where they had a power block. That doesn't exist anymore. You have dividing within the parties, but you don't have any power blocks getting anything done within those dividings. It's still R or D. I've looked at the R and D phenomenon as a problem for a very long time. And every time I brought this up, that why are we stuck with R and D? Why isn't there more I? I always got the same answer. Well, we're sacrificing we're taking stability. We're preferring stability over stagnation. So we like stability. We don't like dynamic. We don't want change. We don't want uproar. We want stability. So guaranteed stability is when you only allow two parties to play the game, and you let those two parties block out all the other voices. That becomes, again, a problem, and maybe less of a problem being that they capped the House at 435. It would be more problematic if they were restrictive against third parties and still allowed the House to grow to what it should be, like we talked about last time, anywhere between 500 to 550 was the low number, 11,000 was the big number. But if you only had R's and D's and you had bigger numbers, that would even be more problematic because you'd have more splintering and less effectiveness and less voice by the people.
Okay. Just a couple of comments. Now we're depressed again, Chuck.
Should have quit while we were ahead.
We should have.
The happy pills wore off. What can I say?
And there's no middle.
No, I always feel like I'm in the middle, though, because I feel like I am one of the few people that I don't feel any allegiances. So it allows me to be more, like, to me, more free to have my opinion. I'm not giving you an opinion because some group above me says that's your opinion. It's more like, no, I don't see it that way. So there you go. I put the I in independence.
I Swiss cheese my tickets still. So.
Good.
But there's no middle in politics today.
No.
It tends to be one extreme or the other. I'm waiting for somebody to come back toward the middle.
Well, it might happen because, again, things are cyclical. We've even seen this within the gerrymandering story, how it starts out, there are a few attempts at it, doesn't do much for the first 50 years. Then we see a growth of gerrymandering from the 1840s, almost for the next 100 years or so. And then right around 1900, it starts to go down again. And then we see a different kind of gerrymandering where the incumbents are gerrymandering to help each other, not to hurt the other party. They're helping their own people. And then we see Newt come in, and then we have the reversion back to the nasty gerrymanderings of today. So it's cyclical, and maybe the extreme politics is cyclical too. Because I always look at a quote by Dwight Eisenhower, who, I'm not a big fan, or I had nothing against him. I haven't studied much about his presidency because it's a little recent for my interest. But there is a quote of his I really like, and it's from his post-presidency. So he was a little more freed up to talk, on his exit speech with the military-industrial complex, and this was maybe a year or two after he left the office, and I'll have to paraphrase it. But basically, he said he's done with the extremes on the right and the left, because on a road, the far right and the far left are the gutters. That's the gutter. He goes, I want to stay in the middle where I can get things done and move forward. To me, that was a very good, analogy. And it was also apropos to his backing the interstate highway system plan of the mid-50s. So that's why I like.
That's how we're going to end it. That's how
That's
I like
a great quote,
we
right?
We could all remember those words and live by them. Stay in the middle of the road.
Saturday Evening Post. Saturday Evening Post, April 1961.
Very nice.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
What's your next performance on? What's your next topic?
War of 1812.
War of 1812. That's great.
Yes.
In an hour and probably 20 minutes, they'll cover the War of 1812.
It'll be so much fun. You're not going to believe it. It's that much fun. It's a great story.
It was a wacky
War of
thing.
1812, a fun afternoon. So come back on December 18th, and we're going to start that one at 2 o'clock. December 18th. So I hope to see you then.
And we'll end at 7:30.
At least. Thanks, folks.